Hello, everyone. Good morning, good day, good evening, depending on where everyone is in the world. And thank you for joining us for this TCFD Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Training Workshop. We're so glad to see all of you are coming from so many different places. And yes, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. We'd love to see where you're coming from, but also we'd love to hear maybe what sector you work in, maybe what kind of job role you have. This also helps us give a sense of who's here and how we can help you best with this training today. So just to highlight at the start, this is a joint training program, and it is coming to the end of this joint training program, which we'll discuss a little bit more why. However, I'd like to thank our partners. We're here together with CDP and IFC, and we've been working together on this training program for quite some time now. And we'd like to also highlight what's next for climate-related financial disclosures on this training. Good to see there's lots of ESG officers, ESG investors here, et cetera. So we hope that we can bring a lot of value to all of you here. Now, as we get started, I'm just going to pass to a couple of our colleagues to kind of set the scene of what is TCFD and where it's going to from here. I believe we don't quite have Relitza with us just yet. So if we want to go to the next slide, Vanina, and I'm going to introduce a great colleague. Michael is one of the original trainers of this TCFD program. We used to work closely together on TCFD in his previous role with CDSB, but now Mike's leading the charge with ISSB, and we asked him to come here today to tell you a little bit about how TCFD is now moving into the ISSB standard. So Mike, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and thank you to both to the SSE, the CDP, and the IFC for hosting this wonderful session. My name is Michael Zimani. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, the IFRS Foundation, which hosts the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And really, the ISSB was set up to bring together and harmonize a number of approaches for reporting sustainability information to investors, to a standardized landscape, and bring high-quality information to investment decision-making. The ISSB has been hard at work, and the standards are almost complete, both on general disclosure requirements and on climate. And we aim to launch these at the end of the second quarter this year. So it's really time to start getting ready to understand the standards and prepare yourself to address them as both companies, investors, but also regulators are looking at the standards and seeing how they can be implemented into their mandatory regimes. Now, we often get asked, what do I do to prepare? And I think this is why you are exactly where you should be today. The TCFD, the four pillars of the TCFD and the recommendations have really been the foundation of the ISSB's work and the standards. And so really what you can do to prepare is to get started with TCFD. So you are in the right place. This is, as Tiffany mentioned, I've seen this session many times, and I can assure you this is, and I hope that you will find it a useful session. So I wish you all a fruitful conversation today, and best of luck in getting ready for reporting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And just to reiterate to everyone, TCFD really is the foundation that we're moving off of as we move into the completion of the ISSB standards, particularly on climate. But if you'll notice, the standards holistically actually use the same four core pillars as the TCFD. So please feel free to ask questions about that as we move forward. And I'd like to also introduce another great partner. Oops, I went a little too far there. I'm just going to try to go back one slide. Oh, Vanina, can you move back one slide for me? It's not letting me. Yeah, there we go. No, just Sue. Sorry. Great, thanks. Sorry about that, Sue. So we have another great partner with us here. So we've been working with CDP on this training since CDSB sunsetted, moving into ISSB. We've been working closely with CDP, and we get a lot of questions in our training about how CDP questionnaire is going to align now with the ISSB standards as well. So I'm going to pass over to Sue Armstrong-Brown, the Global Director, Environmental Impact and Thought Leadership at CDP. Over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Tiffany, and thanks for the introduction, and hello to everybody. It's wonderful that we've got so many people here from all over the world. As Tiffany said, my name is Sue Armstrong-Brown. I'm the Global Director of Environmental Impact and Thought Leadership at CDP, which is the longest job title in the world, but it basically just means that my area of the work oversees the development of the disclosure content and the environmental thinking and leadership that goes into it. As many of you know, CDP is the not-for-profit that runs the global disclosure system for investors, companies, city-states and regions to manage their environmental impacts. It's brilliant that we're doing this, and it's lovely to be here, and I'd really like to express my gratitude to our partners at the IFC and UNSSE. It's been a pleasure for us to work alongside you and to provide this really high quality capacity building on TCFD climate disclosure to markets around the world. And I don't know if it's already been said, because I'm afraid I joined slightly late, but we've trained together over 15,000 participants and over 50 stock exchanges, which is fantastic to see those numbers going up, and I hope will lead to even greater advancements in climate disclosure as we keep going forward. CDP's mission is to drive transparency and action to tackle environmental crisis, and in line with this, we've always been supportive of the development of impactful and high quality disclosure standards and frameworks, because they provide the clarity and increase compliance and support companies in their reporting needs. And TCFD has really served as a remarkable bridge touching financial interests and understanding across the broader environmental goals. So the finalisation of the ISSB climate standard marks a really important transition for markets as we move from TCFD to the ISSB. Last autumn at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, CDP and ISSB announced that CDP would incorporate the ISSB's climate-related disclosure standard into our global environmental disclosure system. And we see this as a major step towards more transparency, accountability and efficiency within the financial markets. And it's a step towards implementing the idea of a global baseline for climate reporting, which is why we're so excited about it. We are the independent global environmental disclosure system, and last year over 18,700 companies, which is worth half of global market capital, disclosed climate data to us. So we can see the scale when we start to implement some of these standards and provide that common platform. And it does mean CDP is uniquely positioned to scale the adoption of the ISSB climate standard across the global economy. So we would like to see the integration of this into our questionnaire as a part of accelerating rapid early adoption of the climate standard. In practical terms, our disclosure system has been aligned with TCFD recommendations since 2018, which the ISSB is rooted in. So the climate standard builds on the 4 pillars that Tiffany mentioned. And these pillars and recommended disclosures are and will continue to be operationalised through our disclosure platform. For many years, CDP has worked to facilitate the building blocks of a comprehensive reporting framework, to advocating for a shared goal of harmonised set of global reporting standards that will truly support corporates to disclose in the most meaningful and relevant ways. Our disclosure platform helps to support implementation of these high quality regulations and standards that we're starting to see emerging. But we don't want to stop there. CDP will continue to go beyond the foundations required by policy, and we want to embody best practice in environmental disclosure, so that by reporting to CDP, corporates, financial institutions and cities, states and regions are preparing themselves and getting support to be the leaders in the global transition towards a net zero economy that works for people and planet, which is what we all want to see. As we know, climate change is an issue that can't be solved by any single entity, element or country. And unlike many other challenges facing society today, climate change requires more than a fair approach and a good partnership. It demands active transition. And TCFD and the ISSB are some of the most effective tools in that effort. And the building of capacity to use them through activities like this training is urgent and vital. There can't be any collaboration to solve this crisis without a common basis. So I really hope that these trainings are valuable for you. whether you're just starting or whether you're far along your disclosure journey. And we at CDP are available to support you at all stages of your journey. Once again, I'm very grateful that you've joined us from all parts of the world and for the work that we're doing together with our partners. I hope this webinar will work for you and bring you the knowledge that you're hoping for. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. And thanks also for highlighting that we have a number of people here that can support everyone on their journeys and moving forward. I do have another colleague here who's doing just that. Ralitza Germanova is a corporate governance officer and runs the IFC Disclosure and Transparency Program. And she's also been together with us in this training since the start and has been connecting global participants to their local IFC offices so that they can have local support on this topic as well. Ralitza, I'd like to pass to you for a few concluding opening remarks. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. Just very quickly, it's a privilege and pleasure to be again with the team on the journey of bringing and increasing capacity on the important topic of climate disclosure. I have two key messages to the audience today. The first one being that the better sustainability and climate disclosure is critical in supporting the creation of sustainable capital markets. And the second one is that the capacity building and technical assistance to companies, stock exchanges, and regulators, particularly in emerging markets, where the International Finance Corporation operates, are needed to prepare them for the heightened reporting requirements. And as it was mentioned, the sustainability reporting policy arena has gone through substantial developments in the past decade, and you'll have the privilege today of hearing from some of the movers and shakers in this space. And particularly this development includes a growing interest in connecting traditional financial activities with sustainability at large, be it through the creating new types of investment products focused on green activities or a shift in products or services provided by the companies themselves, which has drawn the attention to the need of new standards and regulations towards further driving the quality of disclosure done by companies, but also for the stock exchanges, which are growingly introducing listing requirements, central banks focusing on the activities of all types of financial actors, and governments growingly adopting taxonomies of sustainable investment products. And disclosure underpins this shift. Specifically, there is an observable growth in both the interest linked to climate-specific reporting and the regulatory and standards framing of the issues at hand. Given IFC's role as a multilateral development institution that supports private sector development in emerging markets, we are seeing firsthand the importance of setting up sustainability and climate reporting and disclosure requirements. IFC alone invested 32.8 billion last year in emerging markets, of which 7.7 in climate investment, and the ambitions and the intention is to grow further. And just in green bonds, we invested 1 billion and 1.8 in social bonds, and we observe as well a heightened interest. And if you're interested, if investors are looking into this information, actually IFC is going to aligning 100% of its investment to the Paris Agreement, starting of 2025 as well. But as Tiffany mentioned, as advisor, we work on creating capital markets by advising business and governments on enhancing their policies and practices on disclosure and transparency, corporate governance, environmental issues to engage the private investments and improve the investments in climate climate as well. And it takes a village, as you see in the training to date, of standard setters, regulators, stock exchanges, investors, development financial institutions, and other partners to build the capacity and provide such training. And these trainings and further ones are going to happen in the future. And I see who is present in more than 140 countries on the ground, is supporting the local business and governments in implementing these changes. And we are looking forward to continue doing so, and feel free to get in touch with our colleagues in the region. Thank you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Relitza. Now, as she said, it does take a village, but we have, it seems, a village online today. So just want to let everyone know we are here to try to interact as much as possible with you. But given that we do have, a large number of you online, I just ask that you please do make use of the Q&A box so that we can make sure we keep track of all of your questions. Vanina, for some reason, I can't click past this. Oh, there we go. It's working now. Okay. So an introduction to your two facilitators today. So myself, I'm Tiffany Grabsky. I'm the Academy Head at the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative. And I'm joined today with Evan Guy, Senior Global Policy Manager at as part of the Sustainable Finance team at CDP. Together, we're going to be taking you through the content today. However, we're also joined with our colleagues, including Relitza, who just spoke, who's going to be helping answer all of the questions in the Q&A today. So a quick review over what we're looking at today. In the first hour, we're going to highlight what are climate risks and climate opportunities, and how do those link to financial stability and reporting. With that, we'll give you an overview of the global reporting landscape, as we've already kind of set the scene to in the introductory remarks. And then we're going to give a quick overview of what are these recommendations from the TCFD that then the ISSB is building on top of. We understand also that some of these acronyms might be new to you, so please don't hesitate. If we're overusing a bit of alphabet soup, throw it in the chat box, say, can you please clarify that? And we're always happy to come back and respond to any misunderstandings or anything that we're maybe a bit ahead of ourselves on. In the second half of today's session, we're going to look at how do you get started on these 4 core pillars that we discuss of the TCFD recommendations. We'll look at those practical steps, and then we'll do an interactive exercise together. We aim to have 10 minutes of questions at the end, but that's not always possible. It depends on how many questions we're addressing throughout the session. So please don't hold your questions for the end. Ask them throughout the session, and we'll try to get to all of the questions during the session. And if we have time at the end, we will allow you to raise your hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask a question directly. As another part of our housekeeping here, just to note, we have a quick, only 5-minute break in the middle so that you can get up and stretch and maybe grab a coffee. And we will share the presentation at the end. So this slide deck will be shared with you at the end of the session. We will also be sharing a recording on our YouTube channel in 2 weeks' time. So Vanina has thrown and Iperi have both thrown in the chat box that link, and they'll continue to do so throughout the session. So you'll have all the materials and you can revise this in the time to come ahead. Okay. I'm just trying to move forward here. Oh, there we go. I don't know if that was me or Vanina. Thanks, Vanina. Okay, so just as a reminder, this is what you should see on your screen at the bottom. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, please make most use of that box at the top, the Q&A box. That's where we'll make sure we can catch all of your questions. And don't feel the need to have to review kind of all those questions as we're going through the training. We will combine all those questions at the end, summarize them, and email them to all of you within about 2 weeks. And just to give you an overview of the holistic TCFD training program. So today we're in the blue box, the TCFD 101, which is really an introduction to the task force on climate-related financial disclosures and the 4 core pillars that help us understand climate-related risks and opportunities. Tomorrow, we'll be having TCFD 102 sessions. So the 102 session is really to help you build experience in that. We do a lot of case studies and examples. So please feel free to join us tomorrow. And if you haven't registered yet, we'll share the registration links in the chat box. Now, we don't leave you hanging there. This is really, that's the foundation to get you started to understand where to move from. However, after that, you can then provide yourselves with additional education through self-guided online self-paced training, which we call the third prong here, which is TCFD 102E. This is available on the TCFD Knowledge Hub, and we'll talk to you more about that later. Now, the learning objectives we hope to achieve today with you are threefold. First, we are looking to help explain what are these financial risks and opportunities that are associated to climate change, and why is it important to disclose said information. In the second instance, we are looking to help you understand what are the key elements of climate-related financial disclosures and what does good practice look like. And third, to help you identify what are those initial steps that you can take when you're just getting started, or if you're looking to progress on your climate-related financial disclosure journey. Okay, so just as one of the main resources that we use here, we will be sharing a lot resources in this model guidance, the SSE model guidance on climate disclosure. We'll share that link with you in the chat box. It's also on the SSE's website, and it's also on the TCFD Knowledge Hub. This guidance has 5 chapters, and today we're focusing really on chapter 1 and 2. So climate disclosure, setting the scene, and risks and opportunities. We'll often point you towards this guidance to get started, as it provides additional guidance and resources that you can use. So you can see this as sort of a starting point in your journey. And with that, we'd like to know a little bit about you all before we get started. So I'm just going to launch a poll here. Oh, Vanina, I can't seem to be able to launch. Oh, here, the polls are there now. Okay, so you should at any moment now, I just launched it. So in a few seconds, you should see a poll show up on your screen. Great, some of you are already filling it in. What we'd like to know is how you describe your current understanding of the TCFD recommendations. Would you consider yourself an expert? And I know there are a few experts on this call, so I hope to see a few of those fill that in. Do you consider yourself confident but need better understanding of certain elements? Do you have, minimum knowledge, but you need additional support to be able to reach that next level? Or do you have little to no prior knowledge? And any information here is perfectly okay. You don't have to be an expert, or you don't have to know nothing. We're here to cater all knowledge needs. So I'm going to let you all fill that in, and I'm going to pass to my colleague, Evan, who's going to take us through the next section. Over to you, Evan.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tiffany, and thank you all for joining us today to learn about this issue. As has already been highlighted, is only really growing in relevance and importance for companies and governments around the world. So I'll just give everyone another moment to fill out that poll, but it looks like we're seeing the results already. Despite what you said, Tiffany, only 1% thought they were experts. So that's great. These are trainings after all. We're here to learn. So for those of you with little to no prior knowledge, this is great. Please ask questions along the way. If there are any questions that you may have, even if they might seem basic, as there are often others wondering the same thing. And hopefully by the end of these 2 trainings, the 101 and the 102, most of us will be at a more confident level with our understanding of the TCFD recommendations. In this next section, we will go over the context for climate-related financial disclosure, specifically the imperative for action on climate change, why it's important for business, why it's important for financial stability. We'll go over concepts of climate-related financial risks and opportunities, and why disclosure to investors on the subject is needed. The imperative for action to address climate change has become abundantly and widely understood in recent years. The reason for which was made very clear in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports. These IPCC reports synthesize all of the research and science that has been done globally on climate change, which unequivocally points to the fact that human influence has already warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. And specifically, human activities have already caused at least an average of 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming since pre-industrial times. Global surface temperatures will continue to increase until at least mid-century under all emission scenarios considered, and global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded this century unless significant reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. Even with just 2 degrees Celsius of warming, it is evident that the impacts of climate change are already being felt globally. Here are a number of examples of news stories globally showing that these impacts are already being felt, and that there's a growing demand from society for more ambitious action and policy on climate change. If we go to the next slide there, Tiffany. And this is really increasingly feeding through to the business sphere, with businesses increasingly seeing that climate change will have real and tangible impacts on their business performance. Might just pause there for a sec. I think we're 2 slides ahead.
Vanina, can you change this thing? Sorry, for some reason the remote control is not working over here. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe just hop to the next one there. So yeah, just as I said, news stories from around the world. But these sort of understanding of these impacts and the projections and science that we have is increasingly telling us and informing us, and we're seeing that this is really feeding into global and systemic understandings of risk as well. For the 5th year in a row, the World Economic Forum assigned environmental risks, including climate mitigation failure, climate action failure, extreme weather, as top global risks in 2023. This slide shows from 2021, but the trend has only continued in 2022 and 2023 since. Environmental risks, dominated especially by climate risks, really dominate global and systemic risk projections. As such, climate change and its impacts are one of the top issues that businesses must address, and poses a significant risk to the stability of the financial system as a whole. In 2015, while governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney made a landmark speech on breaking the tragedy of the horizons. In this speech, he highlighted that despite the severe and systemic threats from climate change, the time horizons for both policymakers and financial markets are just too short to start taking the necessary action. This observation really then paved the way for the establishment of the TCFD to help address this issue and take a more long-term forward-looking approach. Although it's important to note that the TCFD was very much developed from a financial perspective and not an environmental one, which we'll get into a bit more detail later on. Climate change will pose significant risks, whether they be physical risks or transition risks, to most, if not all, organizations, whether it's in the short, medium, or long term. Equally, there are significant opportunities for companies as well. These need to be worked through and considered as part of an organization's strategic planning and risk management processes. The action or inaction taken by organizations on these issues will have a financial impact, whether it be on their position, performance, or future outlook. And that's all to say, climate change is a risk. Like any other risk, it needs to be treated and reported in the same manner as the other risks that organizations are already considering and managing. Some of the types of climate-related risks facing companies that we see are asset impairment or changes in the useful life or fair valuation of assets, increased costs or reduced demand for certain products and services. We see provision and contingent liabilities arising from fines and penalties that come as a result of more strict emissions regulations. And then lastly, it can manifest in terms of changes in expected credit losses for loans and other financial assets. However, it's important to acknowledge that climate change also has the potential to create many opportunities for business. And we'll talk a lot about the risks, and of course, climate change is scary, so we often do focus on the risks naturally. But it's important to say and to identify and highlight the opportunities of being part of the solution to climate as well. And an important aspect of the TCFD framing itself is to really ensure that businesses are identifying relevant climate-related opportunities and developing strategies to capitalize on them. So some of the examples of potential opportunities for business can include growth and innovation through the development of products and services that contribute to either climate mitigation or adaptation or both. We see companies identifying opportunities through reduced costs or improved energy and resource efficiency. We see companies improving their reputation with employees, customers, and other stakeholders. And last but certainly not least, we see companies that are considering climate risk being proactive, and being proactive helps make them more resilient and ready for any sort of future business disruptions. And together, this can really help ensure that your business is fit for growth and to thrive in a rapidly changing economy. And at this point, we often are asked, or people are often wondering how significant these opportunities actually are. And just to give you an idea, in 2019, CDP conducted analysis of global responses to our climate questionnaire. We published the findings in our 2019 climate report, which identified $970 billion in potential risk for the global economy, but at the same time, $2.1 trillion in potential opportunities. And this shows that while both are significant, the opportunities can actually significantly outweigh the risks for businesses. So now that we've spoken and hopefully understand a little bit better climate-related risks and opportunities, it's important to ask, what information is important for companies to disclose on climate? Well, there are two main perspectives on a key element of that question and of corporate climate reporting that is called materiality. Information on a company can be considered material if a reasonable person, especially in this case, a reasonable investor, would consider it important information. You'll see in this diagram taken from the European Commission's guidance that there are really two key perspectives on materiality. On the one hand, we have single materiality, which focuses on the effects that climate risks and opportunities can have on the company and its bottom line. Whereas double materiality focuses both on the effects of climate risks on risks and opportunities on the company and its bottom line, as well as the impacts that the company has through its activities and operations on the climate through a sort of more mutually reinforcing loop, as you see here. These are both important perspectives for businesses to consider when they're determining what are real issues for them to report on to their stakeholders. However, we're here to talk about the TCFD today, and so it's important to note that the TCFD takes that first perspective. That is a perspective of single materiality, as it only focuses on climate risks and opportunities that could impact the company directly itself. The two concepts of materiality are interlinked, and companies' impacts can be financially material, For example, if you consider a company with significant greenhouse gas emissions and thus a large climate impact, the introduction of a carbon tax or similar legislation is suddenly going to be very costly for that company, which is a climate transition risk that will have a financial impact. Again, both types of reporting are important, but our focus today is really on this context of climate-related financial disclosure and the TCFD that is on the company side. Therefore, it's also important to emphasize, because we often get questions about this as well, we're not talking about alignment. Whilst it can be really important, it is really important for businesses to develop transition plans and set targets that align their strategies with national or global decarbonization targets, for example, by setting a science-based target for net zero. This is distinct from its own consideration of the risks and opportunities that an organization will face from climate change. And so what's important, particularly with the TCFD, is to think through these risks and opportunities that an organization will face under many different climate scenarios, and not necessarily just a target scenario or business as usual scenario, which we will get into more detail on scenario analysis later. At this point, you might still be wondering, why is this important? Why should I care about this issue? And why should I start implementing the recommendations of the TCFD, especially? Well, one of the main reasons is that investors are increasingly using climate disclosures to inform their investment decisions, and investors are really one of the primary users of this information. Full and coherent disclosure on material climate risks and opportunities allow investors to align their own financing with national or global climate goals. Investors are increasingly looking to invest in businesses that are sustainable and that are in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And reporting can be a key way that you're demonstrating to investors the action that you're taking on climate. It also helps investors to ensure risks and opportunities are correctly priced into valuations. Investors want to understand what risks companies are investing in are exposed to and what they're doing to mitigate those risks. And here it's important to stress that all businesses or most businesses are exposed to climate risks in some form or another. And so it's important for companies to be demonstrating that they're aware of this. It also helps investors to allocate capital efficiently by using this climate-related information in their standard evaluating process. And then lastly, climate disclosure really builds on established approaches to wider strategic and financial disclosure to capital markets. And while there's all this sort of range of benefits for investors, it's not only just beneficial for investors. Reporting on climate-related risks and opportunities can offer both listed and non-listed companies a range of external and internal benefits as well. On the next slide here, we'll see that some of the internal benefits are cost savings through identifying opportunities for resource and energy efficiency, improved strategic resilience, identifying potential climate-related financial opportunities that might otherwise have been missed, improved robustness of the company's risk management processes, and then lastly, improved communication between board and management on climate-related issues. Some of the external benefits that we see are improved access to capital, improved engagement with investors, ensuring preparedness for emerging climate regulation. We see companies improving their reputation with customers, employees, and other broader stakeholders. And lastly, climate reporting and TCFD disclosure can really help put companies to establish a leadership position among their industry peers. Now with that, we've already covered a lot of ground. We've covered climate risks, opportunities, a sort of context. I'd just like to make sure everyone is awake and has had their cup of coffee or tea for the day. I know we have people joining us on various crazy time zones today. So if you please answer the question that should be popping up in a second. The poll is, which of the following are examples of climate-related financial risks? Please select all that apply. Is it reduced demand for products and services? Is it increased costs due to extreme weather damage? Is it lower costs due to reduced energy consumption? Is it higher rates of taxation due to carbon pricing? I'll just give everyone a moment to fill that out. In the meantime, Tiffany, do we have any questions that we want to raise for the group, or I'm sure you're busy typing away?
We have lots of great questions in the group, so thanks everyone for sending those through. But because we're a little bit behind time, I probably won't address them verbally. Thanks, Evan.
Perfect. Well, I'll get right back to it then. Perfect. Seeing the answers come in. Wonderful. It does look like I've been clear, which is great. So 3 of these are indeed examples of climate-related financial risks. So reduced demand for products and services, increased costs due to extreme weather damage, and higher rates of taxation due to carbon pricing. Most of you selected these options, and this is great because they are all example of risks. The least amount of you, but a couple of you did select lower cost due to reducing energy consumption. That's not a risk, that's actually the opposite, that's an opportunity. So in going through your reporting, it's important to think through and differentiate between these risks and opportunities. Perfect. So now, having really established the importance of climate disclosure for businesses, in this next section, we'd like to provide you with a sort of overview of the global reporting landscape and how you might try to really understand this. So we've already established that climate changes are really important for business, but we're also seeing that this is accelerating into significant changes in policy, regulation, and standards around the world. But quickly, another poll, just to check in with you all, if you don't mind filling in, which of the frameworks and standards do you currently use to report on climate? Please select all or any that apply. Is it the CDP questionnaire, SASB standards, GRI standards, integrated reporting framework, CDSB framework, or other, or we don't currently use any? I'll just give everyone a moment. Perfect. Just seeing the answers come in. Wonderful. Well, sort of a pretty nice split across a lot of these. A number of people with CDP, a number of people reporting alongside SASB, GRI mix. So this is great to see. It really helps us understand where people are at. And one of the important things to note, and why we like to sort of ask this question, is again, a lot of these sort of standards and frameworks have been aligned to the TCFD recommendations. So for example, if you're already sort of disclosing to the CDP questionnaire, as you heard from Sue at the beginning, CDP has been aligned with TCFD since 2018. You're probably already gathering a lot of the information that you need to in order to fully align with the TCFD. So that's great. Thank you all for sharing that. Within the disclosure space, one of the sort of particular initiatives to be aware of this is really this ongoing collaboration between all of the different sort of sustainability reporting organizations, including CDP, GRI, etc. I know it's often very complicated and can sound like alphabet soup, but the important thing is that over the last few years, we at CDP, together with our colleagues from some of the main standard setters and disclosure works, have really been working towards integrating and simplifying this landscape. And you'll see some of the outputs that have been produced by this group and some of this work on the slide, which have aimed to show how these different organizations' tools, resources, and standards can be used together to provide consistent and reliable ESG information to a wide range of different stakeholders. And in December 2020, a particular paper was released on reporting on enterprise value. The paper focused on those standards that support organizations reporting on their enterprise value to investors within their financial reports. And this gets at exactly the focus that TCFD is looking to address. So if you see on the slide here, you see that red box, that's where we're sort of really focusing on today with TCFD and the sort of forthcoming ISSB standard, as we've heard throughout. If we can move on to the next slide here, we'll see the TCFD recommendations have really sort of picked up traction and really been widely supported since they were first released, since the first standard was finalized in 2017. At this point, over 3,900 companies have become official TCFD supporters, and the TCFD has received endorsement from G7, G20, and a number of governments and regulators around the world. And while the TCFD recommendations were initially designed to be voluntary, many governments and regulators around the world are coming to the conclusion that a mandatory approach is necessary to ensure the uptake of TCFD at the pace and scale needed to safeguard markets from climate-related financial risk. As you see here on the slide, a range of jurisdictions and regulators have already proposed and implemented requirements around TCFD, and others that have proposed it going into the future. And we're also happy to say, even in places where there have been little or to no government engagement yet, companies have been picking up the recommendations and starting to report on those, having understood the importance of providing that information to investors, and also really recognizing the trend that regulation and policy is, there's a wave of it coming around the world and they need to be prepared. Now, in talking about the global reporting landscape, and this has really already been emphasized, but I'd like to re-emphasize it, the work on international standardization is really being led through the IFRS Foundation, which we heard from our colleagues earlier. In November 2021, the IFRS Foundation announced the creation of the new International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, which was tasked with developing a comprehensive global baseline of high-quality sustainability disclosure standards. The ISSB was announced at COP26 in Glasgow and was welcomed by leaders of many countries around the world. The ISSB's remit is to really develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards, with its focus being on meeting investors and other capital market participants in information needs. The ISSB standards will enable companies to provide comprehensive information about sustainability matters to financial markets, and they will try to ensure compatibility and interoperability with requirements that are jurisdiction specific or aimed at a wider group of stakeholders, for example, with the European reporting standards. The structure of the ISSB disclosure requirements is that it will stipulate general requirements as well as requirements related to specific themes and industries. In the time since it was founded, the ISSB has really worked at rapid pace, releasing exposure drafts, the general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related information, as well as its first thematic standard on climate-related disclosures. These standards are being finalized, and it was recently announced that they will become effective in January 2024, which is very, very exciting. Further work will be done by the ISSB, expanding on other topics such as natural ecosystems and human capital as well. But what I'd really like to emphasize here is that the ISSB really build on the TCFD recommendations. You'll see here that ISSB sort of outlines those core pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And these ISSB standards really build on those core elements of the TCFD, looking to really sort of build upon them, not do something totally different, totally drastically different. So important to emphasize that for the discussion today. One other quick thing to note before we just go maybe to the next one, here. Just like to quickly mention one of the other sort of important developments in the international reporting space is the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. So like with the TCFD, TNFD is creating a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report on their broader nature-related risks. Development of this framework is market-led, and there are many different engagement opportunities, so please have a look at the TNFD for more information. But again, similar to as what I just mentioned with ISSB on the next slide here, I'd just like to emphasize the TNFD is really looking to build off of the sort of core pillars of the TCFD, those pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And so really sort of ensuring alignment, and that with the TNFD, if you're getting these sort of structures and processes within your organization in place around climate, it's going to really set you up well for frameworks and standards on future sustainability related topics as well. But with that, I know we're running a little bit behind time. I'll stop and pass it over to Tiffany to take us through the TCFD recommendations themselves.
Great. Thanks so much, Evan. I was just finishing up a question in the Q&A. Thanks everyone for your questions. We're going to move now on to what are these recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Oops, we went backwards. Okay, so just a quick overview here of what are these TCFD recommendations and what you need to know about them. So I'm going to start first with this diagram that you see, the onion diagram, and just highlight what you can see here is that they're all interconnected. So we have on the outside governance, we move into strategy, then risk management, and then metrics and targets. Now, we've often seen these in pillars as well. However, the disclosure never actually appears in pillars. We don't actually have such clear separation between these four core pillars, but rather they help you to get your mind around kind of the importance of each of these four core pillars. When you disclose information, it might, however, appear together. So we'll see in examples tomorrow, if you join us in the 102 session, what that looks like. So a few key reminders about the TCFD recommendations. Now, they were developed to help identify the information needed by investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters in order to appropriately assess and price climate-related risks and opportunities. And they were developed to be voluntary. So the important part there is because they were developed to be voluntary, they weren't meant to be aligned with any particular regulation or standards. They were made to be used by any organization. Now, as Evan was just discussing, increasingly we are seeing mandatory requirements of reporting or disclosure in alignment with TCFD's recommendations. However, that differs from regulation to regulation. So the good news is that these recommendations can be used by anyone regardless of their regulatory situation. They were developed to help report climate-related financial disclosures in your annual mainstream report. And I highlight that because we are often seeing companies report this information in a separate TCFD report or in a climate report, which is great if you have stakeholders that you want to highlight this information to. But the objective here was to pull this information into our annual reporting package that we share with investors because of that first line there, that it's to help identify the information that investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters need. Now, it also discusses transition risks and physical risks and opportunities, which Evan discussed briefly, but we did have a question in the Q&A about that. So just to highlight that those transition risks are those risks that are associated with transitioning to a low carbon economy. So that can be reputational risks, it can be legal or policy risks, it can be changes in the market, consumer behavior, etc. So transition is really about change. And then the physical risks are those either acute or chronic risks that are going to physically impact our organization. So that's big weather events, hurricanes, etc. Or the chronic side is a rising temperature, rising sea levels, and how will that impact our organizations and where our assets are or where our operations are. Now, it's hard to predict those things, so the TCFD highly recommends using a scenario analysis and forward-looking information traditionally in our accounting practices, we tend to look backwards, right? Like we're looking at what are the costs of the goods sold, what are the impact on our revenues, etc. So we're trying to shift that look forward, which can be sometimes difficult for companies. So using a scenario analysis helps us to look through different pathways in the future, because we cannot predict the future, and understand how our company will be able to survive and thrive in these different scenarios that might unfold. And those scenarios could be, for example, a 1.5 degree world where we have a lot of transition risk. So policies changing really quickly. We're having to adjust to many different consumer demands, a lot of transition risks, and hopefully less physical risks, because we've managed to reach 1.5. But we should also understand how our company will survive and thrive in, for example, a 2 degree or a 3 degree or even a 4 degree world, where maybe there's less transition risks, but we will have more physical risks. So really helping understanding what's going to look like in the future and how our company will react to that. And that requires us looking in the short term, the medium term, and the long term as well. And that also requires both qualitative and quantitative assessments here. So if I able, great. So who should disclose this information? We like to say this right up front because the answer really is everyone. However, the task force did identify that the recommendation that organizations with public debt or equity should indeed be implementing these recommendations. However, because climate-related issues are relevant for other types of organizations, it's encouraged that all organizations do start evaluating the impact that climate-related risks and opportunities will have on their organization. Now, I like to highlight here also that the TCFD has provided certain supplemental or additional guidance for certain sector groups. So there's 4 financial sector groups: the banks, insurers, asset owners, and asset managers, that have additional guidance. And then there's also 4 non-financial sector groups. And those were groups that were found to be high risk sectors. Now, some people misinterpret this, thinking that if they're not in one of those 8 sector groups, then they don't need to be aligning their disclosures with TCFD, but rather it's that these are groups that need additional guidance. So those 8 sector groups should use the 11 recommended disclosures already provided by the TCFD for all companies, and then additionally, the additional disclosures that are recommended in those particular sector groups. So where to disclose is also a key question here. Vanina, can you just pop over to the next slide again? Thanks. We've been seeing in the recent TCFD status reports that increasingly companies are starting to pull this information into the mainstream report, but it's still a kind of a trend that companies are starting with a separate kind of TCFD or climate related report. Now, that was not the intention of the TCFD. Disclosure should indeed be provided in the mainstream report. And just to remind everyone, this usually kind of ignites a bit of fear or confusion. How do we get these numbers into our mainstream accounting practices? Now, we are seeing this happen more and more, but just to remind everyone that our annual reports are not only the financial statements, but they also come with explanatory text and additional information so that investors and users of the report can understand those financial statements, because the numbers alone don't really provide all the information that investors need. So in that holistic report package that we're giving investors, we should be including all of this information. We'll discuss a little bit why later, but there's certain information that should always be included, and then other information that we apply that materiality assessment. So we try to understand what is the financial impact, and then provide anything that has a financial impact in alignment with our fiduciary duties. The reason that we do this is because the purpose of the TCFD was to make that connection between climate and finance. So if we're going to connect them, we have to put them together in the same documents. So that really helps to make it clear, not only to the investor, but also for the report preparer, how finance and climate connect. It also ensures that it's subject to the same governance processes and the same sign-off as the financial report. And of course, it makes it accessible. If we're just putting this information in a separate report and we're not at least linking it back to our financial reporting, then it's not going to be necessarily found by the investors. They won't have access to this information. Okay, great. So one thing I like to always highlight when we're discussing the financial statements and accounting practices and how we're going to pull climate-related information into that is that there are key TCFD principles of disclosure, and they're on your screen now, for example, to present relevant information and to be specific and complete. Any of you who are accountants on this call will, however, be very familiar with a lot of these terms because they do align with our traditional financial accounting principles. So, for example, the first one, to present relevant information, aligns with the IFRS accounting standard number 3 on relevance. We also have number 4, to be consistent over time. This is consistent with the US GAAP principle number 2 on consistency, etc. So the TCFD is not trying to create an additional reporting burden here, but rather to make sure that we're pulling in the appropriate risks and opportunities that are facing us from climate and presenting it to investors in a way that is relevant, specific, balanced, consistent, comparable, verifiable, and timely. So with that, a quick quiz before we head into the 4 pillars. True or false, the TCFD recommended that disclosure should be made within a standalone or separate climate risk report. So here's where we see if I was clear or not in the last few slides. I'll give you just a moment there. I see we have a number of hands raised right now. We have a few people who've raised their hands. Just to know, if you do have a question, please pop that in the Q&A. If you're having troubles logistically, you can just throw that in the chat as well, or in the Q&A. Sometimes we can't see everything in the chat because there's quite a few conversations happening there. Okay, I'll end that poll. Congratulations, 84% of you had that correct. The answer is false. So the TCFD does not recommend disclosure to be made in a standalone climate risk report. However, you may do that in addition to including this in your annual reports. Particularly if you have stakeholders that you've identified that climate is particularly important for them and that you want to make sure that you're highlighting how you are acting on climate, then indeed you might want to have an additional report that highlights what you're doing related to climate. But the point of the TCFD is to pull this information into our annual reports. Okay, so let's quickly go through what are these 4 core pillars. We're a bit past time, but we will make up for it later, and we'll still give you your break. So the first pillar, if you remember, was on the outside of that onion diagram, and it is governance. And there's 2 core recommended disclosures in the governance pillar. So a disclosure governance A is to describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. The key word there is board. And then governance B is to describe the management's role in assessing and managing risks and opportunities. So here, what we really want to understand is, how is your board and then your leadership overseeing and making sure that climate-related risks and opportunities are appropriately integrated into then later stages, such as your strategy and your risk management. So what we really want from here is to ensure that there's continuity and that we integrate this as business as usual. This helps to frame the discussion within the organization as well. Things that we disclose here is something like what committees might be addressing climate, the people who are responsible, the feedback loops of communication, how often is this discussed, what are the processes to discuss, to make sure that this isn't, a one-off discussion, but something that is integrated into the business as usual. So the second pillar is strategy. Now, what you'll notice on this slide is we now have in bolded subject to materiality assessment. So unlike governance, where actually both governance A and B are deemed material for all organizations, that means if you don't have the appropriate board oversight and management structures in place to oversee climate-related risks and opportunities, then there's likely to be a financial impact on your organization. So governance is deemed material for all organizations. Strategy, however, for the three main recommendations in the strategy pillar, the TCFD recommends doing a materiality assessment and only disclosing that information which you have deemed to have a financial impact on your organization. And when we say financial impact, we mean this can impact your financial performance as a company or your financial position as a company. And we'll share a little bit more about that later on. So in the strategy component, three main recommendations. The first recommendation, A, is to describe the climate-related risks and opportunities that an organization has identified over the short, medium, and long term. Component B, or recommendation B, is to describe the impact of those climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business strategy and financial planning. And the third, number C, or letter C, is to describe the resilience of your organization's strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree scenario or lower. So what we really want to understand here is, first, what are those material risks and opportunities that might be facing your organization? Number two is, what is the impact of those risks and opportunities? And you will have done an impact assessment also in your risk management processes. And three, what is your resilience? So moving forward, how will you ensure that your company thrives and survives vis-a-vis these risks and opportunities? Now, just to note that there have been updates since the 2017 recommended disclosures, and all these updates in the strategy pillar have been additional guidance. So you'll have this slide and you can see kind of what's been added. I won't go into it in detail since we're short on time already. Now, the third pillar, moving further into that onion diagram, is risk management. You'll see here that we don't have that bolded materiality assessment flag on this slide, and that's because, same as governance, risk management is deemed to be material to all organizations. So if you don't have the appropriate risk management processes in place and you're not integrating climate into those risk management processes, because climate change and climate is a non-diversifiable risk that does impact all organizations, then this will have a financial impact on any organization. So in risk management, the three recommended disclosures from the TCFD is the first one being describe the organization's processes for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. The second being describe the organization's processes for managing climate-related risks. And then the third, describe how processes for identifying, assessing, and management of climate-related risks are integrated into the organization's overall risk management. So we want to understand, how do you identify and assess these risks, which will, of course, then lead into that strategy component, because those that we've identified and prioritized, we will then have to evaluate further. Second, we want to understand the expected impact of those risks. That helps investors understand really how you are doing that prioritization. And then third, expected impact is in the strategy. So the second one is management. And then the management of that is understanding, what are you prioritizing? And then the third is integration. So we need to understand, is climate integrated into your holistic risk management process? Is it dealt with separately? And if so, how do you combine those two risk management processes? And then the final pillar is metrics and targets, which again has that materiality assessment. Now, because of that, a key thing to remember here is that we should always have alignment between the strategy component, which is identifying which are those material risks and opportunities that we're dealing with as an organization, and the metrics and targets. So we should be measuring those same risks and opportunities. So in the metrics and components, or metrics and targets recommended disclosures, we again have three key main recommendations. Recommendation A is to disclose the metrics used by the organization to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in line with its strategy and risk management processes. And then in metrics and targets B, to disclose your greenhouse gas emissions, so scope 1, 2, and if appropriate, 3. And then in component C, the recommendation letter C is to describe those targets used by the organization to manage climate-related risks and opportunities, and performance against those metrics. So here we want to understand, what are you measuring? How are you setting your targets? And of course, what are your GHG emissions? And the reason that GHG emissions was added there is because it was deemed to be material to all organizations. So while we said in this component, we want to apply a materiality assessment, for recommendation B, we had updates in 2021 that really set scope 1 and 2. So that's really the emissions that we have direct or indirect control on. Those are deemed to be material to all organizations, because as emissions rise, there's costs associated with that. However, we also are seeing an increased encouragement for also disclosing scope 3 emissions. Now, this is because the majority of the risks and opportunities related to emissions actually lie within our scope 3, which is our value chain emissions. So really understanding how your value chain is going to be impacted as it increases emissions. Again, here you can see some increase or some changes in the guidance, but as with before, it hasn't removed any guidance. It's just added additional guidance. So certain sectors will get additional guidance in the 2021 TCFD recommended disclosure guidance. But on the website, even if you download the 2017 version, they link to the 2021 one. Okay, I'm just trying to change slides. Vanina, can you pop over to the next slide? Thanks. Quick review then of those 4 core pillars. So we have governance on the outside, which is really our board oversight and management oversight. We want to understand how this communication happens, when it happens, who's discussing it, how often, etc. In the strategy component, we really want to understand what are those physical risks, transition risks, and opportunities that are going to have a financial impact on your organization. And how are you managing those? What impact they're going to have on you? And how are you evaluating the impact in the future through scenario analysis? In risk management, we really want to understand that holistic risk management process. How do you identify, assess, prioritize climate change related risks, but then also climate vis-a-vis other risks? And then finally, metrics and targets, making sure that you're measuring the appropriate metrics. We want to make sure that those are aligned with the same risks and opportunities you've identified in your strategy and risk management, and making sure that you are setting appropriate targets, which you may want to use, for example, the science-based targets. Great, thanks. So just a reminder, there have been updates. So this slide just gives you a little bit of a review of that and shows you all the different guidance documents you can get directly from the TCFD. As you can see on the table there, we have seen a few kind of additions to recommendations. So this one is again discussing the GHG emissions and how in the original recommendations in 2017, they recommended disclosing scope 1 and 2, and then 3 if appropriate. Now they're emphasizing that scope 3 should be evaluated and that scope 1 and 2 should be considered material for all organizations. And currently, as of February 2023, there's more than 4,000 companies that have self-identified as being in alignment with the TCFD and over 100 countries. We've seen significant progress since it was first launched in 2017. We're still seeing, however, limited disclosure on the resilience of a company's strategy under the climate scenario. So additional guidance has been developed on that. We are also seeing disclosure being made primarily in sustainability reports, which, if you remember from before, was not the objective. So we still want to pull this information into our annual reporting package. And we found that large and high impact companies are most likely to disclose versus smaller companies. So hopefully, if we have some smaller companies here, we're helping to demystify this topic and we can help you move forward on that. So a quick quiz before our break, and then I do promise you'll get a 5-minute break. I'm just going to launch this poll here. So what of the following are the 4 core elements of the TCFD? We just discussed that onion diagram with 4 core elements. So I'll give you just a brief moment to fill this quick poll in. Okay, well, it seems like everyone was listening well, so I'm going to close that poll out and congratulate everyone because I think you've got this now. So yes, the 4 core pillars are metrics and targets, risk management, strategy, and governance, which should all be connected and interlinked. So with that, I'm going to move on to our break. So if everyone would like to just take a quick 5 minutes, get up, stretch, grab a coffee, return promptly, where we will discuss how to get started in the implementation of TCFD's recommendations. Thanks. Hey, Evan, go ahead and start.
All right, ready to go. Perfect. Wonderful. So now that we have an understanding of the context and what TCFD recommendations are and why they're important for your organization, let's get into what the practical steps for aligning your own disclosure and reporting to the TCFD recommendations are. So before you even start preparing a disclosure, you should really try to consider the processes within your organizations used to prepare, understand, and prepare material information. You should try to use these existing processes within your organization and adapt them where necessary. This process is really about connectivity, and we suggest considering how disclosures are connected to other information in your mainstream financial report. And it's really about tying it back to tell your organization's story, and it becomes a mutually reinforcing exercise. So strategy disclosures tell how you have elected to respond to climate risks and opportunities, while metrics can tell you how you're performing in this respect, for example. There are lots of sort of tools and resources that you can use to get started. Here's a sort of list of important sort of recommendations, and here is a sort of TCFD to-do list that you can sort of reference throughout your journey on the slide, and we really recommend you keep in mind. One of the first things you should do in your climate disclosure journey is to create a roadmap. The steps of this roadmap will, of course, depend on your respective organization's starting point and context. But on this next slide here, we'll see a sort of illustrative example of what this might look like, which often starts by gathering the right stakeholders internally to create a working group. You might then conduct a gap analysis of your current reporting to better understand where you're at and where you need to improve. The SSE's TCFD checklist, which can be found in the first annex of the SSE's model guidance on climate disclosure, has a really great gap analysis tool that we recommend you using. Once you identify those gaps, you can then move through a process of capacity building and integrating climate-related information into your operations, and finally also your strategy for managing climate-related risks and opportunities. Through this, you will see quickly come to see that TCFD reporting is really a whole of organization exercise. And we got this question earlier about whether this can be sort of outsourced to a third party. They can certainly sort of help, and consultants and stuff can absolutely help, but really in order to get a holistic picture of climate related risks and opportunities and the impacts they bring, a lot of this needs to be sort of pushed and leveraged internally. And we recommend you consider forming an internal working group or TCFD team to address and consider climate change. Some of the most successful approaches that we've seen are where these issues are tackled across an organization rather than just in one department with an organization. So ideally, it should not just be a sustainability team, but also include other teams such as investor relations, communications, auditing, and others. These different professionals from different teams have unique expertise and perspectives that can improve a company's overall approach to climate risks and opportunities and help ensure the resilience of your company. We have seen a number of different approaches taken by companies, such as more top-down approaches where senior leadership really direct the conversation, or on the other hand, there are examples of bottom-up approaches where different functions come together to develop a comprehensive plan. In neither approach, we really recommend that you have a climate champion, someone preferably in senior leadership or even the board who understands the importance of the issue and really can set the tone and lead on setting and approving the strategy. Now, obviously, you don't want to start a bunch of new processes. This can be quite burdensome. So it's important to leverage any existing work, reporting work that you already have. And in many cases, companies are not starting from zero because there are existing internal climate-related information and processes that you can leverage. And as we saw in the poll earlier, many of you have already reporting to certain frameworks and standards. So when you conduct a gap analysis of your existing disclosure, keep this in mind. So are you already capturing climate-related data? How might this data be used for the purpose of TCFD reporting? For example, are you conducting life cycle assessments on your products? Do you have a greenhouse gas inventory for your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions? This information is foundational, and you can use this information to build out to understand any sort of future risks and opportunities throughout your supply and value chains. Also, you should, in addition to existing information that you're already sort of collecting and reporting, it's important to think about existing internal processes that are already in place. So does your board already have a delegated sustainability or a CSR committee that can include climate-related risks and opportunities into its oversight mandate? Or what are your existing risk management processes? How can they be adapted to integrate climate change? And again, with this sort of information point, just to reiterate, there's lots of framework standards already being used by companies that have been mapped and very much aligned with the TCFD. So if you want more information on that, most of the organizations have mappings that can provide you that information, help you understand that. And this leads us to using CDP and CDSB together as an example. There's specific connection between CDP disclosure and the CDSB framework to help you adopt TCFD. You can take a look at our sort of building blocks paper, which is noted at the bottom of the slide here, which specifically maps this out. You can use this resource to help you, as this does not need to involve new reporting if you already follow one of these frameworks. And what's key to emphasize, re-emphasize here is what you're integrating from these other frameworks and standards should be information that is financially material. So that materiality analysis is really important to make sure you're capturing all of that information that you need to. And with this slide and the previous slide, it really shows how much this landscape has really changed since we started doing these trainings and preparing these materials. Because as we saw with this slide and the last slide, CDSB was consolidated into ISSB, and these figures should really show how the TCFD is now feeding into the development of ISSB and the standards that we've sort of spoken throughout this training. But with that, a first step, according to the TCFD, can really be setting the foundation for your TCFD disclosure. So to start with, TCFD has suggested starting with certain governance and risk management disclosures. And while TCFD is ultimately a full disclosure framework, it highlights and recognizes that there are necessary internal processes that need to be developed and adapted. And so a phrased approach can be really useful, as it may take up to 5 years for some organizations to get to full implementation. Governance structures and risk management processes can be used to incorporate climate into internal decision-making and should therefore be thought of right from the very beginning. Although at this stage, we don't expect companies to give a point-by-point granular demonstration of how climate risks are being governed, for example. It's expected at least at the beginning to outline the board's oversight, management roles, and processes used to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. And the TCFD set up this foundation for good TCFD disclosure in these particular areas, acknowledging that they are critical for the context in which financial and operating results can really be achieved. Once you've put that foundation in place in the second phase 2, companies can look to really enhance their disclosures by identifying what risks and opportunities that they have already noted as being financial material to the company and how they're going to affect the business. So these strategy disclosures are really where they can come in here. And along with this, you can start introducing metrics and targets used to monitor your climate-related activities as well. And while governance was a key factor in phase 1, here companies can really go further, building on those initial disclosures by determining, for example, how major capital expenditures may be impacted by climate factors. And again, with the sort of metrics and targets piece, you can start really considering how your emissions factor into this. So your scope 1, your scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, and setting key performance indicators related to your emissions. Then finally in phase 3, companies and organizations can look to really further these enhancements by adding strategy resilience. So this last sort of phase is often recognized as a quite challenging area for many companies, and therefore one that should be looked at once that foundation and initial enhancements are in place. But at this stage, all final considerations should be brought in, all disclosures of the TCFD, including the 4 categories of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. But what I'd like to particularly highlight here is that resilience piece, and that really comes out through scenario analysis. And we identify this as something that can help you early on, that can help you sort of at the beginning look to understand how resilient your company might be. At this phase, we really recommend integrating and bringing in multiple different scenarios that you might consider. So a very ambitious scenario, one around sort of pathway and alignment to 1.5 degrees, or as well as something that's more in line with current policies or current pathways. And this can really help you to understand your resilience as an organization. And in the 102, as a sort of incentive to get you all back for the 102 session, we'll go into detailed examples and case studies of scenario analysis. This is often a tricky area for many people. But with that, just as a moment of sort of quick reflection on what we've discussed, I'd like to ask you to think about your own organization. What key actions might you take to really progress climate disclosure in your own organization? Again, we've got people joining us at many different sort of stages of this journey, whether it's early on or much more mature into their disclosure. But please select one that you think applies to you. Will you establish a TCFD team internally? Will you conduct a gap analysis of your existing reporting? Will you develop a roadmap for TCFD adoption? Will you establish internal climate governance? Maybe you're not sure, maybe not next week, but I think it says next week. It should be tomorrow. We'll give you more case studies tomorrow and can maybe check in with you then as well. Give everyone a moment. Perfect. Well, I'm just seeing the results come in. As expected, sort of a split across these different options, which is totally fair as organizations are at different stages. But if you are indeed just sort of starting, the questions are actually in a pretty good order to consider if you are at the beginning of that journey. So for those of you just starting, establishing that TCFD team is a great first initial step. Then conducting a gap analysis, then developing your roadmap, then trying to establish internal climate governance. There's no right or wrong answer here. So thanks for sharing that. And with that, I'll pass it on to Tiffany to take us through the next section.
Great. Thanks so much, Evan. So I hope that kind of helped to consolidate a little bit about getting started. As Evan mentioned, the TCFD has found that this does take 3 to 5 years from first starting to full alignment with the TCFD's recommended disclosures. So not something that happens overnight or in one reporting process, but important to inform the market of how you're planning to move forward with that. So we're going to do just a quick exercise with you to give you a chance now to think about this, of how this works for you and your organizations, and how you might be able to move forward in your own organization. And we actually have enough time to let you think about this for 10 minutes. So please go to your own corporation's current annual report, which is likely on your organization's webpage. However, you might even be a part of developing this report in your organization. We want you to try to identify, which normally takes a few more minutes than 10 minutes, but take 10 minutes to identify what are the key gaps that are missing. And you can use this phased approach to look at that. Look at each phase and identify whether or not your organization is disclosing this information in their annual report. And then let us know in the chat box what phase your organization might be at and what challenges you're facing to move to the next phase, or what you think what you think your organization might be, roadblocks that might be hitting in order to move forward. I'm going to leave on the screen here the 3 phases so that you have a bit of a better reminder of what are those 3 phases and what information we want to see in each one. So just as a reminder, in phase 1, we want to start disclosing really a lot about your governance and risk management. As we discussed in those 4 core pillars, these 2 pillars, governance and risk management, do not have a materiality assessment lens on them because both of them are deemed to be material to all organizations. So getting started with those processes, making sure that you have the appropriate oversight and management of these risks and opportunities and the correct risk management processes to ensure you're identifying and prioritizing the appropriate risks and opportunities. Then in phase 2, moving forward on enhancing your governance, starting to work on your strategy. In phase 3, making sure that you have everything there. And of course, metrics and targets align with all of those throughout. So please take 10 minutes to review your own disclosure. Let us know whenever you get to some conclusion in your head in the chat where you're at, and then we'll do a quick discussion of that. A few of you are saying you can't hear me. That's because you should be doing your exercise. So those that might have missed what we're doing right now, we've just asked you to look at your own company's reporting and identify what phase you might be in. Great, glad you can hear me now. So we only have a couple minutes left, actually. So if you are looking at your report, maybe try to sum up now and drop in the chat where you might think you're at. And in maybe just 1 minute's time, we'll start discussing those comments because we've had a lot come through already. Thanks, everyone. Okay, well, let's start discussing because we've had a lot of people let us know where they're at, and we're seeing a lot of phase 1, but I've also seen, quite a few phase 2 and phase 3 come through. Quite a lot of you are just throwing in what phase you're at. Not as many of you have told us kind of why you've decided you're at that phase. So I appreciate those who've identified kind of why they think they're at phase 1 or phase 2. The reality is you're likely not to be really fully in one phase. These phases definitely overlap, and you might be, in phase 1 for governance, but already moved quite far along in another area. What you should be using these phases for is to make sure that you are indeed building the right base to move on. So the reason that the TCFD has put these particular areas of governance and risk management in phase 1 is because that helps prepare your organization to be able to move to the later phases. For example, somebody noted in the chat that they believe they're at phase 3, but they're still struggling with the scenario analysis, and their organization still hasn't developed that scenario analysis. And as Evan kind of described, the scenario analysis does often come later on in the phases because the companies are able to, wrap their head around and become more experts on these risks and opportunities that are facing them. A lot of the obstacles I've seen in the chat have been related to expertise and understanding what are these risks and opportunities. So I do highly recommend taking a look at the TCFD recommendations. It is a large document, but you can go into it and find exactly what you need. And they have a really good section on these risks and opportunities. So before we close out, I might just review a few of them for you so that you know kind of what you're looking for as you get started. And while you might think you need to be an expert on the climate side, it's actually that you need to be an expert on your own organization. So these risks and opportunities are already, highly evaluated by the scientific community, and you can use a lot of scientific documents if you want to go into really the details of what's expected in the future. But what you really want to do as an organization is understand how it'll impact your organization. So the expertise really needs to be in your organization, not necessarily in the climate. However, let's review quickly those risks. So in physical risks, we can have both acute and chronic risks. So understanding how weather events will impact your organization. So that can impact, your revenues, your costs, your capacity, et cetera. So you might not be an expert on where these weather events are how often they'll occur, or how many, hurricanes we're going to have, or floods, et cetera. But you should understand, is your organization in a flood zone? Does your organization depend on routes that are seeing more and more hurricanes, which are disrupting those routes? Really understanding the operations that your organization depends on and how changes in the climate might impact that. And then in transition risks, we have policy and legal, which is, our prices of GHG emissions, reporting obligations that we're seeing, litigation exposure, understanding from your organization's perspective how these changes might impact your organization. technology. We could see substitution of low emitting products. We could see unsuccessful investments. We could see costs of the transition. And again, all of these risks are highlighted in the TCFD's recommendations. And you can then evaluate these risks as an organization and identify how they impact you. I don't want to leave without discussing momentarily the climate opportunities. Please make sure as an organization you are still looking at those opportunities. Someone was discussing costs in the Q&A and how do we prioritize and how do we justify the costs related to evaluating these risks, and those opportunities definitely come into play there. As Evan mentioned, the dollar value of the opportunity is actually substantially higher than the dollar value of those risks. So as you'll see in the TCFD's guidance, you can find opportunities in resource efficiency, in energy source, in products and services, in markets, and in resilience. And the TCFD does go into further detail in all of those opportunities. So I hope that helps everyone get started. We only have 10 minutes left. So I wanted to make sure that we are sharing with you all of the resources that you need to move forward and remind you about our course happening tomorrow. So as you get started, please do make use of all of the TCFD's plethora of resources. So you have, of course, on the top right there, the TCFD Knowledge Hub. And you can find anything regarding TCFD on there, including our model guidance on climate disclosure. You can also do self-guided training on the TCFD Knowledge Hub. You can find kind of bespoke products and services, particularly related to governance, strategy, risk management, or metrics and targets. So if there's any particular area that you're wanting to find more information on, I really highly recommend starting with the TCFD Knowledge Hub. Or if you want to kind of wrap your head around each of these topics, you can go to the model guidance on climate disclosure, where we explain the various areas there. You'll also want to make use of the TCFD implementation guide and good practice handbook from CDSB and the CDP organization. And those are all hyperlinked in the slides, which we'll be sharing momentarily. Also, the IFC has some really great resources. So Relitza, would you like to share what the IFC has on offer as well?
Yes, thank you very much, Tiffany. Sorry, we've been typing away answers to questions. It's great to see so much interest and demand. IFC as an investor is a user of sustainability and climate information. And for that, very selfishly, we had created 6 years ago a program on disclosure and transparency, which is supporting companies in emerging markets to improve their reporting, but also working with governments, regulators, and stock exchanges to enhance the regulation and integrate all the new trends in sustainability and climate reporting. We are currently doing an online portal with resources and also a self-assessment tool for annual reports. We have colleagues in most of the countries on the grounds and regional advisory programs, so feel free to reach our people to see what we can do, as building capacity is critical for enhancing the disclosure in emerging markets and bringing the sustainable finance there.
Great, thanks, Relitza. And we also are sharing contact details at the end of this training. And as Relitza said, IFC does have boots on the ground. So if you need a local office to work with, then the IFC can help you in that capacity as well. As a reminder, we have more of a deep dive into these disclosures tomorrow. So again, just like today, we're holding 3 sessions. So tomorrow you can join one of our 3 sessions. These times here are all in Central European time. And what we'll be doing tomorrow is we'll be looking to build a detailed understanding of these TCFD recommended disclosures, those 11 recommended disclosures we discussed today. And we'll look at how you can achieve that in practical implementation through looking at case studies. So we'll show you a number of examples and discuss what's good, what's bad, and what can be improved. And then we'll also do an exercise with you with a few examples. We'll continue to identify those internal processes that are necessary to support climate risk and opportunity reporting. And we'll also discuss the common implementation challenges that we see companies face and how to overcome those. So if you have not registered yet for tomorrow's sessions, you can feel free to do so. We'll share those links in the chat, and you can also find them on the SSE website. Just to note also, we do have this course is certified by CPD, so you can get your professional development credits for participating in this course. We do, however, require you to fill in a feedback survey. So we will be sharing a link. It's in the chat right now. It might disappear as everyone's chatting though, so we'll share it again, and we'll also email it to you after this session. So to receive your CPD certificate, you just need to fill in that survey, and then within a week, we will send you your certificate. Please note, however, you cannot fill the survey after March 9th. So do it soon, or you might miss the chance to get your CPD certificate. And that brings us to a close of our training program today. We had a number of questions asked in the Q&A, which we've been all trying to type very quickly to. I see that we still have 11 that we haven't gotten to. So I might just see if there's any. Oh, we don't have a ton of time, but I'm going to see if I can find one quick. There's a few people who've been asking about the gap analysis tool, so I'll address that one. And so we've been sharing the link of the SSE model guidance, which has in the annex a TCFD checklist. Now, just to be clear, this checklist is the 11 recommended disclosures and the components of those 11 recommended disclosures in a checklist form. So as an organization, what you can do is you can go through and check, does this information appear in our reporting? If it doesn't, then you have to go further to identify if it was in either governance or risk management, then that is deemed material. So you should be including that information. So you should identify what timeline you think you can disclose that information in. And then if it's in the strategy component or the metrics and targets, then you do that materiality assessment. So identify if that particular information would have a financial impact on your organization. Now, on that checklist, it'll be, very vague information. It'll be providing, for example, your governance board and what's the committees involved there. So then you have to identify that link to the specific risks and opportunities that you're identifying. So that TCFD checklist in the SSE model guidance can be used as a gap analysis tool. And we have a few other questions there about scope 3, about whether or not those are going to become mandatory. Now, of course, that depends from one regulatory authority to the next. So you might also want to check out the SSE's database of stock exchanges. So we have a database on our website where you can find the regulatory requirements for stock exchanges in our database. So that might be helpful for you as well. Now, we are out of time now, so before we close, I just want to let you know that we will be sharing a summary of all the questions that were asked and the answers to all the participants by email in about 2 weeks' time. And of course, I'd like to give a very big thank you to our partners who came together today at very odd hours given that we're located around the world. So thanks everyone for getting up early or staying up late. And particular thanks to the IFC who has funded this program and to funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And we do hope that we'll be seeing you all in our TCFD 102 program tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Wishing you a great day or evening.